Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this Irish Wildlife Trust webinar. Delighted you could join us this evening. If this is your first time at an Irish Wildlife Trust webinar, my name is Pádraig Fogarty. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. And the Irish Wildlife Trust is a national non-governmental organisation. We're a charitable body. We've been around since 1979. And one of our main jobs is to raise awareness about the importance of wildlife and to address the biodiversity emergency that we're all in. So if you have enjoyed this webinar, or if you have enjoyed our previous webinars, please do consider joining the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're a membership organisation. You will get a copy of our quarterly magazine called Irish Wildlife. This is the most recent issue. You get that delivered to your door, and you'll get to support all of our campaigns, and you'll get to participate in events around the country that are held by our branches. So you can go on to iwt.ie if you would like to support us in that way. Now, this is our latest in our webinar series. If you want to check out our previous webinars, please go on to our YouTube channel, where you will find the full range of them. We've been doing them now for nearly 2 years. It was in the depths of the pandemic when we started this routine kind of monthly webinar series, and we've covered a great array of topics from the marine to forests and rewilding and all kinds of stuff along the way. So please do check out those series of webinars. It's a fantastic resource. So I'll move on. We have our guests lined up for you this evening, and I think it's going to be a very interesting topic. And I know there's an awful lot of interest in the talk that Ricky was doing before the pandemic hit. I know he was turning up in person, and he was getting great crowds to give this talk. So I'm very excited myself to hear it, because I haven't heard it. And just in terms of housekeeping, the webinar will go on for an hour. We intend to finish at around 8 o'clock. Ricky will give us his presentation, and we'll use the remaining time to answer questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's a Q&A button and there's a chat button. So please use the chat button to chat amongst yourselves if you wish. But if you have questions for Ricky at the end, please do put it in the Q&A button, because that just makes my life a little bit easier if I'm looking for the questions. The webinar is being recorded, as all of our webinars are, and so if you know someone who wasn't able to make it tonight, you will be able to direct them to our YouTube channel. We'll get it up there in the coming days. So that's pretty much it from me. I'm going to move on to our guest now, and I'm really delighted to welcome Ricky Whelan. Ricky is an ornithologist working with BirdWatch Ireland. He is the co-host of the In Your Nature podcast series, which is really fantastic. It's been running now for a couple of months, but I'd really highly recommend it. And Ricky is also the chair of the Irish Wildlife Trust Laois Offaly branch. So a busy man and doing amazing work. And so delighted to have you here, Ricky, and over to you in your own time.
Thanks a million, Pádraig. Thanks for the invite. I'm delighted to be here. Just bring up the talk. Okay. Now, so without further ado, I have a pile of slides to get through, so within the hour, so I'll keep going, and like I say, we can do the questions at the end. So first of all, I just want to say I wasn't always a crow expert. I don't have a PhD on crows, but I moved home from the UK about 10 years ago, and a family friend sort of casually asked me about a big rookery that was in Portlaoise, and embarrassingly, as the sort of as the local birdman and the sort of only ornithologist anyone knew, I actually had no answer for him. I had no idea about the crows at all. I sort of drove past them, you know, 50 times a week, and never sort of paid a blind bit of heed to them. So I was kind of embarrassed then into sort of looking more into them, and I start watching the crows more closely, and an opportunity came up then that November in 2016 to speak about crows. I was invited to speak about crows, so I ended up reading copious amounts of stuff, and the more I read, the more I wanted to read, and I just learned so much about crows. So, and I was delighted then to have an opportunity or an excuse to get it into one place. So this talk is sort of an iteration of that. It's evolved over time, and as Pádraig said, I've given it a lot of places. And pre-COVID, I actually got so bored of giving it, I just stopped. I started refusing to give it after a while. So COVID and a new survey I just did recently has sort of relit my interest in crows. So I hope you enjoyed it. They're a super interesting family and really easy to talk about. Sort of they write it themselves. So the crow family, the corvids, there's over 120 species of corvid family in the family worldwide. It includes the magpies, the jays, and the nutcrackers. So when we refer to crows, we often sort of mean those groups as well, those families. And there's over 40 species in the genus Corvus. So that's what you might consider the true crows, the black guys that we see, you know, your ravens, your jackdaws, your rooks, your American crows, those sort of things. They're the largest of the passerines, and the passerines are the songbirds. So it might be hard to believe, but crows are considered perching songbirds. They're sort of raucous calls, if you like. They do sing, but it doesn't maybe sound like a beautiful song of a canary or a yellowhammer or whatever that we'd all consider a songbird. So, but they are songbirds, believe it or not. Again, I said there's 40 species of true crows, and the word crow simply comes from the Anglo-Saxon craw, which is an imitation of the crow call, if you like. The three guys there you can see on your screen, that's an Ethiopian thick-billed raven. That's one of the biggest crows in the world. It's the one and the biggest passerine. The guy in the middle there is a fella from New Guinea, and that's the true grey crow, I suppose. And they're what we call the grey crow. And then this guy down the bottom right looks a bit like a starling. He's a Streseman's bush crow, again from Ethiopia. His DNA says he's a corvid, but he's very, very closely linked to the starlings as well. So probably some sort of mix, not mix. It's probably like he'll probably end up being split into its own family in the next few years, because scientists love to split and group sort of species like that. So yeah, that's just some of the sort of random ones from across the world. So the crow family, a lot of similarities. So within they're physically similar. They've got dark plumage, they're large, and they're very handsome. I mean, I was parked outside McDonald's yesterday just having a coffee, and there was a family or a group of rooks knocking around the car park, and I was just admiring that beautiful petro sort of sheen off their feathers. They're really, really handsome, smart birds, and that's like the rook, which would be considered sort of one of the uglier ones. And you start looking at the ravens and the magpies and the choughs. Then they're I think they're quite striking birds. They're gregarious, and I have an asterisk there or a star to sort of as a caveat. So there is an exception to every rule. They're gregarious outside of the breeding season and inside the breeding, but they do defend territories. And the rook, for example, where they nest in big rookeries, there could be 1,000 nests. They do sort of defend a small little territory around that nest, basically to protect the structure itself and the chicks within it, but not a wider area like a mag or like a raven that could have, a couple of 100 acres of a territory. They're monogamous, so they do pair for life. That's sort of a cross thing. And again, there's another asterisk or exceptions to all those rules. I'll give you some examples of that as we go through the different species. They're single brooded, so they've one go at it. So if it fails, that's the end of their season. They choose their mate, and I say that again, not all animals choose their mates. Of course, we know this time of year it's the rutting season, and the stags are going around, and the bucks rounding up their harem of females, so they don't get to choose. They're chosen, if you like. But female sort of crows and males are sort of equally. They have level pegging in that decision, and when they join up and sort of develop that pair bond. They're highly adaptable, which is sort of the first suggestion of their intelligence. And we're going to talk a lot about their intelligence across this talk. They're ubiquitous, so they have an almost global distribution, except for the southern part of South America, the Antarctic, and they're not native to New Zealand, but they are in New Zealand now, and they're highly intelligent. And again, we're going to talk about that. So some fun facts. they can eat anything except avocados, which is a funny fact. But I made that sort of point in a talk, a packed out talk in the Botanical Gardens a few years ago, and sure enough, someone's hand sort of shot up and went, that's not true. I've got a pet jackdaw who eats avocado every morning. So that sort of stopped me in my tracks. It's normally a child that stops you in your tracks at these sort of things, but there's a molecule called persin in avocados, and it is toxic to a lot of animals. And I've read a couple of references to it being poisonous to crows and birds, but apparently not to Percy, the sort of jackdaw that lives somewhere in West Dublin. So I don't know, I wouldn't want to test it, and I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to sort of give it a try, but I do like that fact. Scavenging equates only to a small part of their diet. So I think people, especially sort of people would be sus of crows, think that they just live out of bins and McDonald's car parks and cattle troughs and that sort of stuff. They're just constantly pirating food all the time. But no, it's a very, very small part of scavenging is very, very small part of what they do. There's only a few places in the world that don't have native crows, so that's what I said, the Antarctic or and the South America, and then New Zealand. And funny case in New Zealand that they were introduced a lot with other European birds as people did a couple of hundred years ago. It was trendy, and they sort of settled. They did quite well because they're adaptable. And then after a while, the farmers sort of got annoyed and they wanted rid of them. So they used DDT on the big rookeries to get rid of them, and they did get rid of most of them. But after a number of years, they had this big problem with leather jackets, which are the larvae of crane flies, and they eat the roots of arable plants and grass and stuff. So the farmers there asked for rooks to be reintroduced. It's very hard to get a reference for that, but I did manage to get a guy in New Zealand who's an agri specialist, and he does remember, and he's told me sort of per comms that did happen. The crow, the best spatial memory of any of the animals, and the Clark's nutcracker is cited for that. And apparently, a Clark's nutcracker in North America can cache and find almost 100,000 seeds over the winter, and sometimes that's in 3 foot of snow. So you can imagine the landscape. He's caching them when there's no snow, and then returning back to find almost all of them in sort of 3 foot of snow weeks and months later. So that's serious brain power. And the largest songbird in the world is a crow. We already mentioned that. Some collective nouns in case you're interested. Everyone's heard a murder of crows. A congress of crows is more regal and I suppose more favourable towards them. A hover of crows. A parliament of crows makes them sort of sound quite powerful and interesting. And an unkindness of ravens, which I think is a little bit mean. I'll just stop from time to time, put in an eye drop. It's not, don't worry about it. So public perception of the crow, a lot of negative stuff. Their colouring, so back in sort of, people are a bit sus of dark animals and black things and all that sort of stuff, and that's a historic thing, and I'll talk about that as we go on. And there's sort of connotations with the devil and death and darkness and all that sort of stuff, so they don't do themselves any favour all going around sort of in sort of these that dark plumage and big gangs. They eat carrion and that's sort of seen as a bit gross. We don't sort of eat sort of raw dead animals off the side of the road or whatever, so people sort of a bit sort of sus of them. And back 100 to 1,000 years ago, to be literally eating the bodies still alive on battlefields, so it's not sort of that pleasant. They've got an association with witchcraft, which people are obviously a little bit uneasy with, and there's a lot of fear and historic sort of stuff around witchcraft. They travel in raucous gangs, and there's been lots of sinister portrayals of them. That murder of crows, and the famous one is Alfred Hitchcock's film The Birds, which did a lot of harm for seagulls or gulls and for crows. And a lot of people still haven't recovered from that. Luckily, it was before my time. I've seen the clips. I've actually never watched the full movie, but it is pretty sinister stuff. They're loud and raucous. They are, and there is a lot of them. So when they start making noise, they can make a lot of it. They're seen as bullies, but again, that's kind of just because they arrive in gangs. They need to eat too, I suppose, but it's very difficult to see that when you're trying to feed your robins, your wrens, and your blackbirds, and then all the jackdaws show up, and the feeders are abandoned by the little fellas. they're ubiquitous. So I think, when something's common and everywhere, there's a little bit of disdain, or a little bit of sort of, maybe not disdain, but just, you don't really care about them. You just forget about them. They're there, so maybe that doesn't do them sort of any good either. And they're seen as an agricultural pest, and that's quite a common scene, with at the bale, at the silage pit or whatever, a couple of dead rooks hung over the silage pit, or there, a hooded crow to warn them off. But like within like 30 seconds, all the crows, the word has went out that their buddy has been shot, and like they're not stupid. I'd say they avoid the area for about 20 minutes. Some positive stuff as well, though. People do know it's out there, that they are very highly intelligent. They're interesting and accessible, and that helps in that they're ubiquitous as well. So you can go anywhere, like you can drive down to the McDonald's car park and see them and study them. You don't have to go to sort of Kuala Lumpur or anywhere sort of terribly far off to get good observations of interesting behaviours. The popular culture, so I suppose the last few years, going back a little bit now, Game of Thrones and the Starks and the three-eyed raven and all that sort of stuff, that would have done them no harm at all. Like during the days of Harry Potter, when everyone rushed out and bought white owls, and there was an illicit owl trade going on at the time. So I don't know if lots of people went and got ravens, and I'm sure they all got tattoos and bits and bobs. So yeah, what harm? That's a good thing. And are they farmers' friends? So I mentioned that example in New Zealand. That happens here as well. I mean, they are a big predator of the leather jacket, which is and other agricultural pests as well, which is obviously a very, very good thing for farmers and landowners. So we've 7 corvid species in Ireland. I normally ask at live talks, what are they? But we'll go straight into it because we haven't got time for that. So there's the jay, and probably my favorite thing, and Gaeilge has a sort of habit of doing this in capturing things so well in the way it names them. And the Irish name for the jay is Screech Old Quilla, which is the screamer of the woods, which I just love, and it's just perfect. The first time I ever heard a jay was in a place on the Laois Offaly border, Garryhinch Wood. It's split by the Barrow River there, and I was walking down that forest path, and it's a broadleaf woodland. It's lovely. And next minute I heard this really raucous sound, and I was like, geez, I didn't know any better at the time, and I felt it was a bird of prey sort of attacking another animal or whatever. And little did I know, a few weeks later then I seen the jays and I heard the call, and I put 2 and 2 together, so I learned that's what it was. They're very clever, and inadvertently they perpetuate their own habitat, in that they cache the acorns every autumn. You see them the last few weeks. They're still going with them now because the weather's quite favorable. Good crop this year probably. And especially if you go to a woodland that's split by a road or a river, it's a really good time, because you can see them sort of commuting over and back with beak full of acorns going to their cache sites. And what happens is they forget a percentage of where they've cached them, and those become little saplings, and then you've got yourself a little bit of oak forestry going on. And they are sort of given the honor of probably having planted the great ancient oak forests of Ireland and other places as well, before we arrived and settled and start chopping them down, or whatever we did with them, whatever the rumor is about chopping them down for the British galleons and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a pretty cool thing. So nutcrackers and jays sort of grow their own, they farm for themselves, and they're looking into the future. So it's a good thing. Jays have a huge distribution as well, so they're all the way over here in the west, right over into Eastern Asia, and also the same species. So yeah, they're pretty impressive, and they can stash up to 3,000 acorns in a month. So it's pretty cool. Whoops. Sorry, this isn't moving for me. Okay, so the magpie, great species, Pika Pika. Everyone knows them. A lot of people dislike them. They see them sort of, there's all these obviously stories. There's 2 things in particular that people say a lot, is that they're introduced and they're not native, which isn't true, and that they came from Italy, and some people say France, and they may have done, but any bird, with the power of flight, can get across the English Channel and the Irish Sea and all that, and occupy an island like us pretty easily. So it's not really an argument to say that they were introduced. they've got a huge distribution again, and they're interesting in that they've got a interest in social structure. All crow families do, but they do divorce, and which is good. If they think there's a social sort of rank to be gained, they will divorce. And they also do this thing called pair guarding, and because there's a thing called extra pair paternity, where the female will allow a blow-in or a sort of a bit on the side to come in and copulate with her. And that's a thing, because they kind of nest in loose colonies. That's to allow sort of the genetic diversity in there. The sort of females control that a bit, because if it gets too sort of insular and inbred, obviously it's bad for the species and bad for the family. So they do that. So that's why you see two birds quite close together all the time, because that's the male chasing the female all the time to make sure no one's giving her the slip. So that's called pair guarding. So if she goes behind the wall, he's behind the wall. She goes up the tree, he's gone up the tree, all that sort of stuff. So watch out for that. That's called pair guarding. That's gas, and they do it all the time. And if you're in a large housing estate, especially in autumn now, when the leaves have finally fallen off the trees, if you look around, you'll actually see magpie nests in various places, and that's cluster nesting, and that's a loose colony of magpies. So they do nest in colonies. We're all familiar with the rhyme as well, which is another very sort of Irish thing. And there's 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold. That's as far as I ever used to go as a child. And then there's 7 for a secret, never to be told, 8 for a wish, 9 for a kiss, and 10 for a bird you must not miss, which is the most interesting one, because I don't know if it's a bird like with wings, or if it's a bird sort of in a mini skirt heading up the town. I'm not sure, but it's very interesting. We never got beyond sort of 6 or 7 when we were kids. So it's nice to have found out the rest of that rhyme over time. So yeah, the Father Jack's sort of glasses and the myth of them stealing shiny things. The BTO, which are very, very scientific and recognized and what's the word, respected science ornithological organization in the UK, have done various studies on magpies' preference for shiny things, and all the times it's come back negative. And actually the last time they did it showed that they're kind of skeptical of shiny things, a little bit nervous of them. So, but you say that at any event, and you get a couple of hands up saying, that's not true, I found a magpie nest full of this, or a local magpie used to steal this on us, or take tinfoil or whatever. So there's no smoke without fire. There's something going on there, and whatever the BTO study is, that just the hypothesis isn't being tested right or correctly or whatever. But yeah, it's really interesting, and we all love that famous clip of the local magpie stealing Father Jack's glasses, which was just hilarious. Yeah, jackdaws, little blue-eyed boys. So they're little small, handsome guys that nest in chimneys, in sort of nooks and crannies, in old cottages, and in ruins and mill buildings, and kind of little urban dudes. They're small, black crow with a short bill. 84% of their sort of diet is plant material. So again, they're not sort of hanging around getting chips all the time or anything like that. They have a complex social structure, and rank affects their sort of partner choice. So the higher you are ranked, or whatever, lower ranked, the less pick you have of the bunch. And they will divorce in their early years as well if it benefits them in rank, sort of. So if an older female gets divorced or her mate dies, a younger one will try sort of pair with her, and he'll then get brought up that social ranking, and become more sort of important in that sense. Their winter, they're inquisitive and they're cheeky, and their flocking behavior in the winter, it all goes by the testes of the males. They get very swollen, and they just switch into mating mode, and they can't think of anything else, and that's all they do. But when that sort of swelling goes back down, literally, they become gregarious again. You start getting the big winter flock. So it's complex, but that's what controls it. So that switch that goes off in them is just chemical, and they can't sort of get beyond it. The chuff. So if you're from a coastal county, or you visited the coast, there's a call. I don't know if you can hear that. It's quite electronic. I find it sort of quite unusual, quite characteristic. It's normally how I pick them up before I see them. They're really, really buoyant in flight, beautiful birds. Their Irish name is Cagcus jarrig, which is red-legged crow, which is, you know, exactly what it says on the tin. And their Latin name is Pyrocorax, so it's fire crow. Going back to that sort of redness in their bill and their feet as well. So they're quite beautiful. They hang around in family groups. They are territorial, but they will tolerate sort of members of their family from past seasons, which is quite interesting. They do feed and roost together, and they have this hierarchy, which is evident especially in cliff roosts. So what will happen is the older, more dominant birds will go on the inside of the crag. So there'll be this sort of ledge along the cliffs, and they'll all be in a row, sort of stacked along there. The older guys will go inside, sort of deeper inside, and then they'll leave the younger ones, the first year birds, on the outside. And the reason is because first thing in the morning, first guy that goes past is the local peregrine. And if you're on the edge of the roost, you're being plucked off first. And if you're one of the older, more dominant birds, you're not going to put your hand up for that. So you send the young lads out to the front as cannon fodder. So it's quite interesting. Again, shows you the hierarchy and rank, and the social structure is just so important among crows. The rooks, very, very common. Probably the most common bird in Ireland. There's hundreds of thousands of them, and they're amazing, and they're large, and they're interesting, and really interesting social structure as well. And hierarchy is a big thing there, and I'm going to get into rooks in detail as we go on through the talk. Just a couple of their identifications. So you got down the image that popped up at the bottom, the cluster of 3 photos. So down the bottom left, you've got a full adult rook. You've got that big grey bill, and then you've got that basal plate around the base of the bill. And that develops only after 2 years fully. And that's actually an adaptation. It's an extension of the bill, so you can get further down into the soil to get the likes of those leather jackets and other grubs and bits and bobs and vertebrates that are down there. That bigger picture on the right-hand side is a carrion crow, a young carrion crow, and they're black with a black bill, but they look very like a young rook, which is the guy in the top left. And the difference is, I don't know if you can notice the forehead. The rook has a very severe kind of vertical forehead, almost like a step, whereas the carrion crows have this sort of wedge-shaped head. So that's the way to tell those youngsters apart. People do mix them up from time to time. We don't get that many carrion crows in Ireland, the full black ones, and I'll tell you a bit more about those in a minute, but we do get a few of them. So there is times where people have mixed up or thought they've seen carrion crows, but actually they're just young rooks. The hooded crow, grey crow, skull crow, they have piles of common names, and that's why we use Latin names when we're talking to scientists and ornithologists, so we don't get confused about what species we're talking about. So the hooded crow and the carrion crow, up until very recently, were considered two morphological versions of the same species, if you like. So the grey crow had that grey body, and the carrion crow was all black, but were the same species essentially. But they've been split in the last couple of years. They might be sort of, you know, stuck back together again by scientists in the next few years. They're always sort of doing that. But so our guy is Corvus cornix, which is the hooded crow, and then Corvus corone is the carrion crow. And you can see the distribution map there. It's quite interesting. So it's all like, it's like the Gaelic version of the hooded crow is in Ireland and up Western Scotland, way up into the Hebrides and all that sort of stuff. And then there's this mad divide up in Northern Scotland, and then from there down right into Northern England, down into England and then Wales, you get sort of only those the carrion crows, the fully black guys, which is just really interesting. They can hybridize with the carrion crow, and they do, and which makes things sort of more interesting. But the hypothesis is that the female hooded crows, the sexual selection is that they prefer the grey colored ones, and that's the only thing stopping them sort of full hybridization and them just being sort of one sort of morphological version of themselves, if you like. In Ireland, they occupy a similar sort of niche as ravens in bogs and bleak wildernesses and the coast and stuff. They, you know, they're quite good predators, and they're, you know, a lot of people do go out and kill them and trap them and stuff for that reason, for their own reason. But they're quite intelligent, and yeah, they're a smart looking bird too. And then there's sort of king of them all, the raven, the northern raven, Fiach Dove, the black hunter. Like what can I say about them? They're just whoppers. I'm going to play their call. Hopefully you can hear that. It's working for me anyway. Not working. Try again. No, anyway, it's quite sort of a guttural, deep tone and it's designed to sort of go across big valleys. Guy called Ratcliffe wrote this sort of the book, you know, the Bible on ravens, and he commented that there's never more than one pair of ravens in an estate. So you can imagine the size of some estates in Britain, and you know, they defend the territory that size. So you're talking about sometimes hundreds, thousands of acres of a place. The word ravenous comes from the word raven, and they've been present consistently since the last ice age, so from 13,000 years ago. So you know, they've been around, and it's quite interesting. You know, same things. They do this really interesting thing, or they can do this really interesting thing called rapid repairing, and it's when one of the pair is lost, for whatever reason, be it they're shot, they just succumb to something, I don't know, whatever, they get poisoned, trapped, whatever. The other one can have a full partner recruited to substitute in within hours, and that is crazy if you think that they have been defending a territory of sometimes miles, and that all of a sudden they can just replace them with this thing. But ravens, when they're young, they go around in these teenage packs before they are sexually mature and before they select their mate. And that's where they sort of do their dating and figure out who they're going to mate with. And there's sort of a theory that they always have sort of their eye on one other. You know, it's kind of a bit of a side salad thing going on. It's kind of like, well, if I don't have a date for the Debs, you can come with me, that sort of arrangement. And they reckon maybe that's how sort of they can find someone just so quick like that. So like literally a female can be on eggs, incubating eggs. Back in the day when there was no sort of ethics in science, lads would go out, shoot the female on the nest and see what would happen. And by dinner time, there'd be a new female and laying a clutch of eggs with the existing male. So it's mad, really just crazy. But I'm going to tell you some other stories about ravens as we go. But yeah, they're just huge and powerful animal, and just quite significant in over history and in mythology and all that sort of stuff. So they're just fab. So some facts about the raven. So they're considered one of the smartest animals. We're going to talk a lot about that. Ravens can imitate human speech. That's a good suggestion of intelligence, and a lot of animals that can do that. Dolphins, you know, parrots, sort of stuff like that. It is a good suggestion that they're an intelligent beast. They're featured in many myths. We'll get into that. Ravens demonstrate rapid remating. I just told you about that. They are very playful, which is another thing about intelligence, and we'll go into that. Ravens do weird things with ants, so well, other birds do too, but that's typical sort of way. This is some of these things come off an American website, but they basically will eat enough ants to get the formic acid for them to basically get drunk, which is quite funny. You can find videos of that on YouTube and places, and it's worth watching. But I've seen it in Attenborough documentaries about other animals and birds as well across the globe, so it's not unique to ravens. They're highly adaptable. They show empathy, which is we always thought was very restricted to humans and sort of the higher apes. Ravens roam around teenage gangs, so I said that, yeah. So until they're 3 or 4, they're not sexually mature, so they stick together really, and to try sort of survive and find enough food. And you can imagine in some of their geographic locations, you know, it's not that easy to survive, and there's not that, you know, pickings are slim. Ravens weigh about the same as a human brain, which is 3 pounds. The average brain is 3 pounds. That's just interesting. That's a bit of bird. A raven's nest is known as an eyrie, and ravens are awesome. That's a fact that I added myself there, as you can probably tell. So wolf birds, so going back now, and they've been sort of through time referred to as wolf birds, and there's this sort of symbiotic relationship, or has been, with wolves over sort of many thousands of years, probably millions of years. in that, for example, if a wolf pack attacked, a large mammal and it escaped on them, that the raven flock would alert the wolves to its location, knowing that the wolves would finish the job and leave the ravens the carcass. So there's stuff like that. Again, it's been observed with polar bears and things where ravens don't have the hardware maybe to rip open the carcass of a dead moose, so they'll actually alert a larger animal to it to do that job for them, knowing full well that they're going to benefit from it down the road. And that's called mutualism or symbiosis. So that's a sort of ecological thing. Same has been depicted by humans in cave drawings and stuff like that, or at least that's what we've sort of thought. That's what they're trying to do. Again, one spear mightn't kill a large sort of type deer back a couple of million years ago when they were building them bigger then, and the wolves would sort of, or the ravens would bring the humans to the carcass or to the injured animal, knowing full well that the lads are going to skin it, throw a bit for the ravens, and everyone wins. The crows and humans, so they flourished crows have flourished in a human-dominated world, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk a bit about mythology, evolution of species, landscape, and changing opinions. So significance of ravens. So there's huge sort of a myth and legend and religious beliefs. They've been referred to for many a year. They have association with death, possibly derived from their fondness of carrion, including like the people would have been observing ravens and large crows pecking the sort of dead and dying bodies on battlefields for thousands of years. Whatever the belief is, that they're all seen as powerful, whether it's for good or for bad. All the depictions are that these crows are powerful beasts and have got powers and see things. Good example there, top left picture is a carving from the Native American, a very ancient tribe, the Hadida people, and they believed that the raven was the creator. So you can see that carving there. That's the raven sort of, and humans or human race being born, of the raven, so created by the raven. So that's their belief. The raven was depicted in the Bible. Noah had one on his ark, and there's a lot of maritime sort of traditions with ravens, and we'll mention that in a minute. And then again in the Quran, in chapter 5, and it's in that same stories in the Bible, a raven showed Cain where to hide Abel's body after he killed him, and the whole brotherly rivalry thing there and all that story. So they are sort of depicted in a lot of religious texts. Ravens and Vikings. So we all have seen the Vikings and various films and read things and books and all that sort of stuff. And the raven is quite sort of closely depicted with the Vikings. And that's mostly through a naval tradition or a maritime tradition where the ravens would have been brought on boats, and after a while they would be released and they would be allowed to fly. And if the raven flew off in a certain direction and didn't come back, that meant they met landfall, and that's where they would head for and hopefully find the island or wherever they were looking for to sort of settle or pillage or whatever they're up to. Our man Odin was always depicted with these two ravens, and he had one called Hugin and one called Munin. One was meant to be his thought and the other one was meant to be his memory, and that's what made him such a sort of useful and powerful god of war, because these two ravens would go forward across the world and basically bring back all the information, so Odin could get his strategy together and basically look after his enemies quite easily. He also had two wolves, which were Jerry and Frecky, and they were sort of more his physical rather than his intellectual sort of side, if you know what I mean. So yeah, so the Vikings have a very close affinity to ravens and crows. The Fingal County Council logo is supposed to be a raven, and that's owed back to the Battle of Clontarf. It looks more like a hooded crow to me, but it is indeed supposed to be a raven. So that's what that link is there. So in Irish mythology, we all know the story of Cú Chulainn, and after he sort of did an awful job of Maeve's army, he basically butchered thousands of them guys over a few days and weeks, and he eventually died himself through an injury. But he sort of walked back across the river, and he lashed him. He sort of tied himself to a rock because he wanted to die on his feet like a true proud warrior. And after 3 days, his enemies still wouldn't cross the river to see if he was dead because they were afraid he'd sort of butcher a few more of them. So after 3 days, Morrigan, or Boiv Caha, the Raven of Battle, or Macha, as she's known, she could sort of turn into a raven, and a hooded crow she's always depicted as. And you know, she had a few names, which is always, you know, it always means trouble. And she landed on his shoulder and sort of gave it away that he was finally dead. And then they came across and sort of pulled his body asunder and all that sort of stuff. And that moment is captured, or that myth, or that mythological story is captured in the big bronze statue in the GPO in Dublin. It's beautiful. It's worth seeing. And that's where that comes from. And yeah, so Morrigan was the female Gaelic god of war, and she was a real piece of work. And there's a lot of depictions of her and stories, and you know, all these deities were you know, associated with crows a lot, and not for you know, and they're not good stories normally. You know, the chieftains would have relied on the crows and the ravens for messages and tidings of, you know, if the harvest were going to sort of work out or fail, or what the weather was going to be, or maybe what battles were going to bring and who was going to win them, and all that sort of stuff. Lots of depictions and reference to that in the texts. And then this guy came along, did that all the harm, and even got rid of the snakes to boot. So anyone that's interested in biodiversity in Ireland shouldn't be a huge fan of St. Patrick. He well, basically he represents Christianity in this way. And in a lot of Christian texts, you start seeing references to stuff like God, or sorry, the devil's own bird, and this sort of stuff. And they sort of start, you know, almost like this religious propaganda that, you know, these stupid pagan gods or demigods and stuff were you know, are dangerous and blah blah blah, and trying to sort of get it into the psyche of people that it's bad and all that sort of stuff. And you see those references more and more as time goes on in Christian texts, and beliefs start sort of working through the whole thing. It became more and more suppressed. Human opinion. So we know, especially in Britain and across Europe, that ravens in towns were actually welcome. There was no sanitation back in those sort of medieval towns, you can imagine. And like literally the offal was being thrown out on the streets, people's waste was being thrown straight out. So any sort of animal that came and would help and clean up and keep diseases down and all that sort of stuff were welcomed. And they were. And like red kites would have been common in large towns and cities across Britain and Europe. Sort of started Europe started to clean up its act first, or a bit more technologically sort of advanced before us further west. And so then it was more of a British thing, I suppose. But and then, you know, ravens would have been common in towns as well. And then along came the Tudors, and Henry VIII was always trying to sort of be very cool and European and all that sort of stuff. So he would have followed suit with sort of Europe in that, and tried to sort of get more advanced and modern and all that sort of stuff. So he would have actually allowed parishes to put a bounty on crows and other grain-eating species, for example, to sort of help get rid of those. So that would have started. That would have been the first nail in the coffin for ravens and other beasts like that. Later on, then Charles reinterpreted the acts that preceded him, and he was more proactive and actually paid bounties and funded parishes and regions to kill birds and mammals, such as ravens and moles and those sort of things, because it just wasn't seen as sanitary or cool anymore. And then of course there's the ravens in London Tower, where there's I think 6 ravens are kept, and it's said, or the belief is, that if the ravens go out of London Tower, that the crown will fall. So these 2 guys are called Odin and Thor, and they're the sort of 2 pet ravens. But they've got 4 other colleagues that people don't really talk about either. So but they're still there, and there's a raven keeper in London Tower, and that tradition and belief is still at least served or kept up to some degree. So yeah, sort of mixed things in that culture. So the success of crows. So crows are, with the exception of the jays, are a bird of the open countryside. So as soon as we settled and we start sort of cutting down the trees and farming, crows would have begun to sort of become a lot more common. God, I need a lot of slides to get through still. We then, again, modern culture is very wasteful and made a lot of opportunities for crows as well. So, you know, crows boom. So it's a very modern phenomenon that we have as many crows as we have. It's all down to sort of agri-intensification, clearing land, all that sort of stuff. So then modern opinion, we became a bit more sort of, I suppose, nuanced and woke. And we've got nature reserves now and modern, you know, popular culture and all that sort of stuff. And we look a bit more, you know, upon sort of, you know, old-fashioned sort of thinking maybe is a bit, you know, naff, and we kind of protect these things a bit better these days. So crow society, sorry, I'm speeding up here a bit. Going to go talk about the gregarious nature of crows and then their territoriality, but I'm gonna look specifically at rooks and what they do. They're quite fun species. So so rooks have a very structured annual cycle, pair formation, all that sort of stuff. They happen at different cycles, and the winter flock formation, all that sort of stuff, all happen. They're going to talk about that cycle now. So let's talk in autumn where we are now. So from August through to September, small family groups coalesce into flocks as that sort of breeding season ends, and it's not so critical anymore. And these flocks then begin to sort of get bigger, and they return then to their winter roost sites. Then in the winter, the flocks grow larger. In Ireland, into winter months, large rookeries form with both adults and younger birds. Juveniles may roost separately and with jackdaws as well. So the roosts basically get bigger between November and February. They're at their biggest. Then in the spring, the flocks begin to disperse a bit. They go back to these smaller, their rookery sites, which is anywhere rooks nest, and I'll describe that in a minute. And in March, and the adult pairs return to the rookery and breed. So the pair bonding begins again. They'll start preening each other, all that sort of stuff. And then in the summer, they'll lay their eggs and rear the young, and then again in summer, family groups continue to forage until late July into early August. So that's the sort of the annual cycle there. So their annual sort of whereabouts is all across the spring and summer. They're at rookeries, and rookeries is where they build their nest and breed. But in winter, they're at their roost site in the evenings, and that can be where the rookery is, or it can be a totally separate place. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. So, and then there's these things what I've seen described as parishes, which I like. I like that description. It works for me, and I'll tell you why. So, so this time of year now, they're at the roost, and what happens is at the roost in the evening time, as it becomes dark, they've been out in the countryside feeding all day. And they start to return, you know, as it starts to get dark, the last hour of darkness, and they return back to the roost site. And the one example I'm going to give you is the one called the Downs Rookery in the middle of Portlaoise town centre. And there's a few thousand birds that spend the winter in those trees overnight. And what happens is it's stratified in that there's layers in the roost. And so when the birds arrive back, the more dominant birds, they go to the tops of the branches, and they're up there and they're happy out, and that's where those dominant pairs go. The subordinate birds then go in the lower branches, and the first year birds and second year birds and stuff, the ones that aren't even mature enough to breed, they're at the very bottom. And the reason is because information filters upwards, and all the immatures are saying, oh, I found a pile of good grain over in Strably today. Oh, he's in Abbey Leaks, there's a load of stuff there. The leather jackets are so juicy, whatever. All that information is being filtered up, and the older birds are getting the best of that. And meanwhile, all the poo is coming down. So if you're at the bottom, you're giving away all your good info, but you're getting all the shit on your head, and obviously that's not good. So that's why those adult birds are up there. Makes a lot more sense to do that. Then I've observed this behavior as well in a really bad storm, really winter, really wet day, that actually the older birds will make the young birds flip, and they'll make them go upstairs, and that's to protect them from the worst of the rain. So they'll tolerate it most of the time, but it gets really, really bad, and they actually make them flip. I've seen that more times than not. So if I went to Portlaoise this evening, what I'd probably have observed is a load of different birds coming in from all around the place, coming from different localities where they've spent the day feeding, because they spend the days feeding out near where their own small rookeries were during the summer, and because they go and roost there back during the day, and then they come back to this sort of parish church, this parish centre every evening, and that's the large rookery, and there'll be a few of them around the county or around an area or whatever. So what happens is then the first, those first couple of 100,000 birds or whatever will settle. And then there's always a few hundred lads that are, forgot to sort of leave on time and will come back late, almost at dark. And the whole thing has to get up and rearrange itself. You might have seen it before. They just alight again in this huge, big sort of raucous sort of thing. They're all going around giving out, and then they'll resettle back in their layers, in that societal layer. And it's really, really quite interesting to watch. So if you've got a roost nearby, check it out, because that's what the rooks do. Sometimes there'll be a couple of hundred jackdaws in there. Sometimes the magpies will even join them. I've even seen some jays, a handful of jays, and even a raven or two, and a hooded crows on the edge of these as well. But normally they're mostly made up of maybe I'd say 60–70% rooks, and then the rest jackdaws, and then on a handful of other bits and pieces. So here's the parish. So what happens is, you got this big sort of rookery, or you got this big roost site. And then during the day, when they wake up, they head back out to the area where maybe a couple of kilometers away, where they've nested that summer, and they'll feed in that area. Because if 1,000 birds, 2,000 birds were to land in a field together, it just would be too much competition. So they do split up during the day. Once they have their initial feed during the morning, it's time to go have a rest, because you don't want to be sort of going around wasting energy if you don't need to, because there's buzzards looking out for you, there's sparrowhawks, there's peregrines looking out for you and stuff. So you want to be out of there. You don't want to be burning energy flying around up to nothing. So you go back to that tree that you nested in, you sleep there for a few hours, again in the afternoon, then you feed again, then you go back and you go to the main roost, so the parish centre, in the evening. So that's what they're up to. So that's what this map depicts here. And that's why I like the idea of the parish. You've got all these little small areas, little townlands and bits, but everyone returns back to the parish centre. Then there's a centre of the parish during the winter. So bird brains and crow intelligence. So this is really important bit. So what is intelligence? So crows can't sit a leaving cert. So you can't sort of give them 600 points in the leaving cert and say, oh yeah, you're super intelligent. So it's basically how you test that is you give them novel challenges and see if they can solve them. And that's a good way of testing intelligence. They've no prefrontal cortex in the avian brain, so we always just assume they were stupid, because that's where all the sort of this executive thoughts are supposed to be formed in humans and the higher apes. So we always mostly just sort of thought they were a bit stupid. Back in the World Wars, when we used to use carrion pigeons for messages, there was a lot of money put into studying pigeons, because they were trying to sort of get the edge on the other armies and their enemies and stuff. So science is very like that. It's whatever sort of trendy at the time money will go into. So for years, pigeons were really well studied, and no one thought about crows at all. They were worthless, So it sort of took some sort of nuances or whatever for people to bother looking at crows at all. Their brains are interesting in that we've got this cortex. Our brain is all folded and stuff to make, fit all those neurons and cells and space in there. The crows, the birds evolved differently. They got to the same way. They got a lot of brain space, but they don't have that cortex sort of thing going on. What they did was, if we both have a sheet of A4 paper with all the information written on it that you need in your brain, what mammals did, or what mammals did, what humans did was they folded it so tightly to get it into the little ping pong ball skull, let's just say. But what birds did was they wet the sheet, they rolled it up, and they got it into that same space. So there's sort of more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. And birds do have, so we know that, like, for example, canaries, for example, the amount of neurons increases by hundreds and thousands during the breeding season to build their capacity to remember more songs, to impress the ladies, and to have a bigger repertoire of tunes and stuff. So they can actually grow and shrink their brains depending on when they need it. So that's quite an amazing thing. So crow intelligence. So the last time we were related to birds was back with these little stem amniotes, those like little amphibians. So we look like lizards, and then we sort of branched off, and we became the mammals and the apes, and then humans, and then the birds went off and did their thing, the dinosaurs, and evolved from them. So it's kind of like our last ancestor was a lizard. So the way they've arrived at their sort of cognitive ability is totally separate how we got ours. And the same mammals and humans sort of got that leap on them as soon as we evolved digits, because once you use digits, you can start forming tools, and once you form tools, you can start forming more technologies and building other things, and then sort of it brings you, you drag yourself up. Whereas if, so they're saying maybe if, some people have said if birds had hands, we'd be all in bother, they would literally be taking over the world. A bit of Alfred Hitchcock stuff going on. So it's really quite interesting. You see those funny videos of birds running around with little hands drawn on them on YouTube as well, which is quite unnerving. So maybe that's what's going to happen next. So they do say that the brain size is sort of, reflects the intelligence. So definitely, it definitely across sort of a lot of the animal groups, the vertebrates, that is the case. The reptiles, the amphibians, not very smart at all. It's just a bit of a sort of brain stem at the end of the spine or whatever. Same with the reptiles, getting into small mammals, and then before you start seeing brain size equate to the size of the skull and the animal a bit bigger, you're getting into to the monkeys and the apes and all that sort of stuff. Here you see the size of domestic pigeon and a New Caledonian crow, same size bird, but there's the size of the brain. So the crow he's a heavyweight when it comes to the body brain sort of weight ratio, which doesn't always sort of reflect, but it is a bit of an indication. So they say that crows are smart. So they're smart as a chimpanzee, are up to as smart as a 7-year-old child, and the dolphin. So a lot of common things there. So all those animals are gregarious, and they can mimic speech. They like to play, and they show empathy. So those are sort of indications of intelligence. Jesus, where is the time going? Park, if you have to stop me, just let me know.
Carry on.
So crow intelligence. So we're going to show some examples of observed intelligent behavior. So their adaptability, play, caching food, learning. I won't show them all, but I definitely want to show you the first one. So let's cut straight to that. Oh, I mightn't be showing you anything. Oh no. Okay, well, this might speed my talk up quite a bit. So this one, this was a video on YouTube. You're gonna have to find it afterwards. It's narrated by, it's from one of Richard or David Attenborough's shows. It was an Asian crow in Tokyo, and what they were doing was they were using the cars to crack these big walnuts. And not only were they using the car traffic to crack the walnuts, they wouldn't land in the traffic for fear of being knocked down. So they were doing it by pedestrian crossings and waiting for the light to go the red and the walk light to go green, and then they were landing down and getting the cracked nuts. So that's a really good video to watch. I know it's after happening. I brought the slides across without bringing the videos across, so I won't play them. So it'll be quicker for me to describe them, but do please look it up. So Asian crow in Tokyo, you'll find it's a famous video, and it's really quite interesting. So that just shows how adaptable they are in that sense. Caching food. So this video is boring, but it's better if I just describe it. So it shows the theory of mind, which is we thought was again a thing sort of restricted to humans. Theory of mind is when you sort of consider what the other person is thinking. So and it gives us that's what gives us like our social cues. This guy's bored, he doesn't want to hear this, or I need to leave the room, or he's sussing me out or whatever. So with this crow was walking around his backyard with a piece of food. I think it's a dog biscuit or something to hide. But it hears another crow over its shoulder, and it's aware it's there. So he's like, this guy's watching me, he's going to take my nut later on. So what he does is he fake sort of caches it a couple of times and sort of then slips off somewhere else and puts it in his final place. So that's theory of mind. That's a really sort of high level sort of cognitive ability in an animal. Next one was fun. Oh, this is a pity I can't play this one. Just Google crowboarding when this finishes. So this is a video of hooded crows in Russia using a sort of jar lid to snowboard down a roof, and there's a family watching it and filming it on a phone. But that demonstrates that they're having fun. And if you are an animal, and especially if you're a bird, all your focus in life is surviving. And that's like I described their daily routine there. You get up, and the first thing you have to do is recruit the energy that you lost staying warm the night before. If anyone's into a bit of bird ringing or has ever had a bird in the hand first thing in the morning and then again catch it like an hour later, the difference in the weight is humongous. They lose huge body condition overnight. So what they have to do is rush out the next morning, feed up at feeders, a feeding site or whatever. Go roost for the day, stay out of trouble, make sure the peregrines aren't after you, make sure you're not burning that energy because you have a whole night ahead of you again. That's all you can think about. That's like, there's no luxury. But if you're a crow and you're super intelligent, you have enough food, you know where your mate is, you know where you're roosting that night, and you can go snowboarding for the day. That just shows huge intelligence and sort of adaptability, and that you've got your life sussed. This is a really interesting study here. A guy called John Marsloff in the University of Washington was trying to figure out if crows could recognize faces. And not only could they recognize faces, birds that didn't experience the face or the experience, the other crows had passed on the information about these bad guys. And the way they tested it was to use two types of masks. To use a Dick Cheney mask and a caveman mask. And they walked around the campus in University of Washington, and they sort of where all these American crows nest, and they were sort of just getting about it just to see if they would sort of, you know, identify it and be scared of the mask. They weren't. They just thought there were other humans on campus. The next day, they'd done the caveman masks, went back out, caught a number of the crows, color banded them so they knew which ones they had caught, and the next day put on both masks again. The caveman mask was scalded completely. They were attacking it, they were afraid of it, they were shouting, they were screaming at it, they didn't like it. They completely ignored Dick Cheney, just like it was another student or staff member on campus. Not only did they keep recognizing for the next 6 years, all the chicks of those birds in proceeding up to four seasons later all had the same response to the caveman. So they had actually, the parents had taught them that these are bad guys. Don't go near the caveman guy. He's going to catch you and put something on your leg. So it's really, really quite interesting. In a typical American sort of response, the military now fund a lot of John Marsloff's work to see if they can sort of teach crows to go in and recognize, I don't know, the likes of an Al-Qaeda target to sort of, I don't know, send in a drone or whatever in the next time. So John Marsloff's funding is safe for the next years, but I don't know if he's ever going to crack it for them really. But anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. Loads and loads of experience of videos about them solving novel crews, like you know, that they can like displace water by using like heavier objects to make the food rise up so they can grab it quicker, all that sort of stuff. Loads and loads of those on YouTube as well. This one is about tools. So they know now that the New Caledonian crow makes tools to fish bugs out of logs and sort of stuff. And they also, the entire Hawaiian crow population is in a zoo in San Diego, and they now realize that they're able to do it as well. So they don't know if there's other species across the globe that could do it. So they are now starting to they've evolved to use tools now, which is really, really super intelligent. Again, taught only by humans, and the great apes could do it. So local crows. So the Downs, I told you that I was shamed into, or I was so ashamed that I started looking at the Downs crows. So in 2016, 15 and 16, I did a full census. And in the winter of 2015, I found that there was 3,700 crows roosting there at that site. And in the summer, there was only 188 nests, so 400 birds. So that goes to show you that that site isn't the main rookery, or there's so many rookeries around to make up the sites for the rest of those birds. There's only 400, there's only 10% of the birds nesting there that roost there over the winter, if that makes sense. Following year, a few more birds, over 4,000 roosting, but it was only over 200. So again, only about 10% nesting there than the winter. So it's those can be really, really important winter sites and still good nest sites, but it's not always the same thing. So we put up a sign there to talk about the local crows and Irish crows, and it's a really nice site, and that's where I always go if I want to talk about or see crows. It's just an amazing place, and all those behaviours I described in Rooks happens there on the night, every night in the winter. Recently, just the last spring, early spring, I put out an ask on Facebook for people to identify the local rookeries in Laois, and we got 174 unique locations observed. You can see the map there, quite interesting. So kind of fills what we thought would happen. So they like open countryside, and they like mature trees to sort of nest in. So wherever you get that, they will nest. You can see the sleeve blooms up in the top left hand corner. So they don't like the uplands. It's just too bleak for them. It's difficult terrain, and it's the sort of terrain of hooded crows and ravens. So they tend to stay out of it. You can see over there, far over west, that's 2 sites over in Kennedy. That's actually in the Offaly border. So once you start going across that is in Offaly. So once you you start going across Slieve Blooms, you don't see any crows until you hit sort of lower lands in Offaly again. There's just color coded, so the ones are green are 100+ nests, yellow 50 to 100, and then lots of smaller ones from 5 to 50 nests. So you're talking about a lot of different sizes of rookeries, a big range. So there's just the sort of whole list. If anyone's interested, I can share it. There's just the cluster. So there's a little parish in Portlaoise. So you can see in the middle, right in the centre, is the Downs Rookery and a smaller satellite one there. And then you got all these satellite ones around the town. So that's just Portlaoise alone. So you're talking about, a couple of 100 nests there in the summer, and then the huge Rookery there. All those ones around there are probably all returning to that central one to roost during the winter. That's just some acknowledgements of the people who were involved. And you see here, this is really interesting. This is zoomed in on the N78 between Strably and Carlow. You just have this mad linear sort of row of rookeries the whole way along. So whatever, rooks seem to like quick access into Carlow for whatever reason. Here is my suggested reading list, getting towards the end here now. I can get Pádraig to put that out on social media or whatever. But that Bird Brain top left-hand book, pretty new, well, it's out a few years now, by Dr. Nathan Emery. That shows all those examples of the different experiments, talks about all that stuff, all the things, the Washington work, all sorts of stuff. So it's a good reference book. It's not sort of book that you sit in bed and sort of read for 3 or 4 hours. It's kind of one that you pluck through and look at the different examples and the hypotheses and all that they tested. But it's really interesting, really well illustrated as well. If you're a science teacher or something like that, be really interesting. Glyn Anderson's book about bird mythology and folklore and all that sort of stuff is really interesting. It's covered all the crows, and that's out years and years. You can get it quite cheaply paperback as well. And it's a brilliant book and really good reference. The Mind of the Raven by Brent Heinrich is brilliant. He's over in Maine in North America. He does all sorts of stuff with captive ravens, and it's just super. Like he'll capture ravens at a roost. He'll hide a moose carcass out under snow miles and miles away, where no one has seen them, and the birds won't find them. And then he'll bring 2 of his own ravens to the carcasses, show them where they are, and the next morning they'll have the 500 buddies over where they went back and relayed the information, stuff like that. Really, really interesting, really well written, and his relationship with the ravens is mad as well. So really, really worth reading. Mark Cocker's book Crow Country is more of a sort of novel about his depiction of the crows in Norfolk and all that sort of stuff. It's a nice read. It's one you'd sit down and sort of read a couple of nights in bed or whatever. The Magpies and the Raven then are the monologues about those 2 species, and they're the Bible. So the Radcliffe, the Raven, they're hard to get, but they're the Bible on those two species if you're interested. So do check them out. There's the podcast. So the big QR code on the right will bring you to the website for all the episodes, and then that small one in the logo will bring you directly to the Crows episode if you want to. It's a lot of stuff that I would have said tonight, but if you're in the car or whatever the next few days, you want to sort of double down on that sort of stuff, please do. And we do enjoy making a podcast, so it'd be great to have some new listeners. And that's it. Thanks very much. Any questions?
Well, bula bus.
Thanks,
Well done, Ricky. Take a deep breath there, and that was really fascinating. I can see why the talks were so popular, and you were packing them in. Fascinating stuff. So look, I mean, you have spoken there now for over an hour, Ricky. So I mean, do you want to take a couple of questions?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, they are. It's fascinating because we see these birds every day. They are, as you say, they're kind of everywhere, but they're also kind of diverse as well. We have a beautiful magpie that comes to our garden every day. That's kind of piebald, it's kind of got white feathers on it. It's really distinctive. So we know that, it's the same bird coming back to our garden, and it's really gorgeous. And it's also funny because I live in Fingal, and as you pointed out, the raven is the kind of logo for Fingal. And when I was a kid, learning how to do bird watching from my garden window, we never saw ravens back in the 1980s. They were considered kind of rare, and you had to go up into the mountains and ravines and things. But now I can hear ravens flying over. When I have the window here open in the attic, I can hear them. going around. So they've obviously increased in number of late. So I mean, maybe there is a question coming. There's, I mean, so they are beautiful and they're fascinating, and they've also increased in number. But I'm just wondering, maybe is there any evidence that that's a problem? I mean, one of the reasons I noticed that a lot of people don't like corvids, and particularly magpies, even though they're so beautiful, they think they're a threat to the songbirds. You know, they're going to come and they're going to, eat. They're going to eat all my lovely, colorful little birds, and I don't like these big brutes coming along. I mean, is there any evidence for that?
Yeah, so they're absolutely a symptom of intensification of our opening up, and I suppose a dumbing down of our countryside. So the more, I think, diverse habitats we have, in that sense, is going to carry more diversity, and it's going to be more naturally sort of processing and operating and self sort of managing. So I would say, yeah, and they've got very few predators and all that sort of stuff. So for, like, I mean, from an ornithologist, from someone that's into ground nesting birds and all that sort of stuff, there's way too many hooded crows and probably rooks around the place that haven't been here in previous decades. So yeah, and there are efforts and there's ways of dealing with that and all. But then there's another sort of group of people that don't like that either, that just want nature to sort of have its own, run its course and all that sort of stuff. But when you start interfering from way back when, and then you're trying to put stuff, legacy issues right then, it's tricky. So no, I would say there's certainly an argument there that there are certain too many crows in the landscape for and then others will say that there's an ecologic thing that people have heard called a carrying capacity, and a species, when it meets its carrying capacity, means that there's not enough food to carry it, or there's not enough mates, or not enough roost sites or whatever, that they're just self-limiting. But I don't know, sort of crows, especially rooks, don't seem to have hit that ceiling yet. I would say when people give out about the likes of magpies eating small songbirds, that's a naturally occurring thing. So that has always happened across time, and that's why blue tits have, 2 or 3 broods, and they have sort of 9 or 10 eggs in the sort of hope that they'll, 1 or 2 will survive, and they'll get their sort of genetics sort of out that way. So there are strategies to deal with that sort of stuff, but I suppose where that gets out of sync because the habitat's wrong or whatever, there's other pressures, environmental pressures, it certainly doesn't help. So yeah, but again, it's all legacy issues. When you start tweaking that sort of stuff, it's like flood management. If I sort of look after my own land, I'm letting the water down to the next guy. It has to be sort of done, the whole way on the catchment, so it's so tricky. But I think, yeah, there's probably an issue there.
Yeah, and I know kind of foxes have the same kind of reputation, and maybe they have benefited from that kind of simplification of the countryside that you talk about. And I was reading recently how shooting foxes in the UK, there's no evidence that it has had any impact whatsoever on the population of foxes. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about the was it rapid remating?
Yeah,
a great phrase from was it the hooded crows was doing it?
That's ravens.
The ravens. And so you might be out with your shotgun thinking you're doing good, but like by dinner time, Mr. Raven has a new mate laying the eggs.
I had a very smug, threatening conversation with a guy a few years ago about, he was bragging about shooting the local buzzards, and I was kind of going, oh yeah, great, you're just such a great guy. And I mean, within a week I was stood in the same place and there was a new pair of ravens set up, and it's just not ravens, buzzards. And yeah, it's just like they're out there, they're just gonna just replace that. So it's funny, it's pointless.
Yeah. Somebody's asking there's lots of interesting questions here, but there's one about how old can the roosting sites be? Can the rookeries last for many generations?
They can. So the guy who asked me the initial question is a guy called Niall Kavanagh. He is of my dad's sort of generation, so he's in his mid. He's just gone 60. So he remembers it there as a very small boy, the one in the Downs. And he reckons his dad used to play there as a child and remembers the rooks as well. So that's probably, you can add another sort of 50 years on that. So so that's probably there 100 at least, over 100 years. But I also know of stories where they just vanish with no explanation, trees not been touched, no poison laid, no one shooting or anything like that. So sometimes just out of nowhere they'll up sticks and go, so with no explanation. So that's also a thing that occurs. So yeah, I think they can be there for many hundreds of years. And in that book, Crow Country, Mark Cocker makes references to some that he can find reference to many hundreds of years of old. Yeah.
And it's interesting because we have birds like cormorants, maybe herons to a lesser extent, that roost communally like that. But the cormorants will completely destroy the tree. The whatever is in their dung strips the tree of all its leaves and everything. There doesn't seem to be any effect like that for large numbers of rooks in a tree, is there?
No, it doesn't at all. And it definitely, I mean, it actually, more what happens is you get this huge understory of the likes of elder and ivy and stuff on the forest floor. So it's obviously a bit more, it's more nutritious or nutrient rich than it is sort of harmful. So yeah, I don't know if it's the fish content and that acid that burns off the trees. And also the cormorants and herons will nest and roost in those trees when they're in full leaf. So they're probably getting more sort of burn from that, from the surface of the leaves. But whereas the rooks and stuff are in there during the winter when the leaves are mostly gone. So that might be a factor as well. I'm not sure.
Now, there's some questions here, and I don't know. I mean, crows are intelligent, but I mean, how far do we go with this? Somebody's asking, do crows mourn? There's another one who's asking, Sean is asking, do they live in the moment or do they do forward planning?
Yeah, there is evidence that they do forward planning. There's examples of that in what's his name's book. I think, I mean, you hear about magpie funerals and that sort of stuff. I think some of that stuff is us projecting human feelings and activities and behaviors on them. I would say, being a bit more cynical and having watched crows for some years now, that if it's a magpie and he's looking at his buddy dead on the ground, to me he's sizing him up as a potential meal rather than where he's going to bury him. And there is that sort of cut and trust of nature that you don't waste a good meal if it's there. So I think when you see a magpie dragging another magpie off, that's probably what's happening. It's not for a wake and a burial. So yeah, but I don't know.
Yeah. Marion is asking, are rookeries protected?
No. So, well, all birds are protected at their nest sites. Potentially, supposedly, in writing, but they aren't. No, so there's no sort of. I think technically, I'm not. Yeah, I think you could probably still get a felling license when there's rooks actively nesting in a rookery. Yeah, unfortunately, it's crazy. It's crazy. So the only protection maybe you could afford them is a tree protection order. But then the landowner has to agree, and there's not a great tradition of those in certain counties at all. Some counties have loads, but you're just hoping that there's enough cop on there, but it's certainly not a guaranteed thing. No.
Yeah. Scott is wondering, why do jackdaws socialize with rooks? He says they're always in groups. I mean, is there any interaction going on there, or what's?
Yeah, but it's strictly probably in the benefit of the jackdaws. So the rooks have those huge bills. They can get right down inside. You normally see the jackdaws coming straight after them, trying to access the same sort of holes because that they're after excavating for them. And interestingly, starlings do the same with jackdaws, in that the jackdaws will sort of excavate these holes, and then the starlings will sort of scamper behind and try to get in and see if there's anything they've missed. So I think it's strictly that. I suppose their niches are slightly different as well, that they don't compete for nest sites. They probably don't compete directly for the same types of invertebrates. Jackdaws probably go for something smaller, and starlings something smaller again. So it's no harm for them to be there for the rooks, and I suppose it's an extra eyes and ears out for the rooks as well, protection as well. So what's good for the goose, good for the gander.
This is a good one from Gavin. He wants to know, is gang warfare a thing for rival magpie gangs?
No. I don't
Maybe he's just watching the male running after the female to make sure she's not getting up to mischief.
I think so. You do see them scald each other sometimes. I think that's that'll be youngsters maybe stepping above the pecking order, just getting a bit of a hiding off a couple of the older lads. And I think that's probably what you're seeing there. But I would absolutely love to see magpies sort of having a dance off in a car park somewhere. That would be,
they do hang around in bigger numbers, so sometimes do they?
Yeah. you do get them. Yeah.
Very good. Look, we leave it. I've one other one here for me, and maybe we leave it at that. And this is from Charlie, and maybe it's going back to your point about where magpies introduced. They weren't always in Ireland, were they?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I presume they had to arrive here at some point, but I would say they probably reintroduced themselves after the Ice Age. Is what I would.
Okay, I thought it was much more recent than that. I thought it was like 1700s or 1800s or something like that.
I don't know.
Okay, maybe look into that.
Yeah. I know that answer for the next time.
Okay, and what about choughs? I mean, you know, most of the crow species are pretty common and doing quite well from a conservation point of view, which makes a difference for most of the bird groups. But choughs are not, maybe the odd one out there, not as ubiquitous, certainly. I mean, are they? What are the numbers doing like at the moment? Do you know?
They're doing okay. They're solid enough, I think. Like you say, they're not massively widespread in Ireland. There is they do go slightly inland in sort of upland areas near the coast, and there is a cousin. They've got a cousin called the Alpine chough in Europe that goes right up into the mountains as well. But they're mostly restricted to the west and north and south coast. In this country, but no, they're holding their own as far as it's been for the last while. There's actually a talk on the Cork Nature Network, or is that what they're called? Are running a talk about swifts tonight. Actually, hopefully they recorded it, because I'd like to see a guy called Sam Bailey, very good ornithologist, is given that. He's been tracking them and running for a while, but no, they're doing generally okay. But I don't think we're going to see them all over the place. They've got a very specific niche, that sort of coastal cliffs, macher habitat. That's just, they're probably restricted by that more so than any other limitations.
Yeah. I mean, they're quite, if you're looking for them, they're quite easy to find, though, if you go to the right spot. And certainly around the Copper Coast in Waterford, any of the islands off Connemara, they're really fantastic. And as you said yourself, you hear them most before you see them, but it's such a distinctive sound. It's and if you do get to see them, they're really beautiful. A beautiful kind of very scarlet red beak on them. But a fascinating group of birds. And Ricky, thank you so much for your talk, and wonderful to see so many of you at home staying for the full length of that. It's fantastic. We had over 300 people at one point tuned in, which is very impressive.
Excellent. Delighted. Enjoyed it. Thanks, everyone.
So just thank you again, everybody at home. As I say, if you really enjoyed it and you want to share it with your friends, it'll be online in a couple of days. And like I say, if you do enjoy our webinars and you support the work that we do, please do join the Irish Wildlife Trust and help us keep these things free and help us to spread the word about wonderful nature. And certainly we are working with our colleagues in BirdWatch and other organizations to try and address the biodiversity crisis. So thanks again, Ricky, and good night to everybody at home. Take care.
Night, everyone. Thanks.